Hi everybody, welcome to Design in the Diaspora, a V&A Dundee event series that kind of deals with the work of diasporic artists and designers that are kind of based across Scotland. My name is Ewa Effiom, I'm your host tonight. I'm a Belgo-Nigerian architect and writer, and with us here we have the inimitable Leo Robinson. Maybe we can start with like a quick introduction. Tell us about your practice. How would you describe that to someone that isn't aware of it?
Okay, so firstly, I'm a visual artist who works and lives in Glasgow in Scotland. Predominantly, my practice takes the form of painting, drawing, collage, sculpture, and also often brings in sound and installation as well. I tend to work around ideas of ritual and kind of imagining new ways for people to integrate ritual into their lives, and like belief systems, kind of interrogating what belief systems are, what belief systems we have, and like how we can renew them, take existing ones, bring them back together, etc.
Amazing. Your kind of identity seems to be at like kind of crossroads, and some people might even call it hybrid. And I was wondering how that, if at all, kind of is manifested in your work.
You say my identity, sorry?
Your personal story, your
yeah. It's interesting. I don't feel like my practice predominantly deals with like my personal story, but I think it's like the way that my practice tends to work is I take my own experiences and try and find what might make them common to more of like a universal image of like the human experience. So yeah, I think like at one point there was quite a strong boundary between like, oh, this is stuff that exists in like this allegorical, metaphorical world that's talking about like, you know, a universal thing, and then there's like the real world, which is a separate thing. And I don't know, I think more recently I've been trying to like blur that boundary a little bit and be like, I don't know, I guess give hints of like who I am and my identity and how I feel about myself in a kind of intuitive way. Like I think in a lot of the recent work there's like, I did have this compulsion to just be like, oh, I'm gonna kind of record myself just like dancing in the studio. I'm gonna put this in the work. So it's just like, I guess there is this thing of just being like, oh, here I am. Like this is me. But a lot of it it's geared towards the universal and trying to find the processes that we all go through and how we can understand that through imagery, you know, and ritual, and spaces.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting you say that, because the work that I've seen of yours kind of seems to be, as you say, kind of interested in these kind of universal kind of belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
If I may, I mean, maybe this is completely wrong, and hopefully you'll correct me if I am wrong, but you seem to be kind of interested in a spirituality that is happy to, for want of a better word, kind of appropriate from different belief systems. And I believe that that's maybe because of trying to kind of attain this kind of notion of the universal, kind of spiritually encompassing the kind of belief system.
Sure. Yeah.
There was like a reference somewhere that I read to Saint Anthony, the Torment of Saint Anthony by Michelangelo. And your work in Michelangelo in using symbols that are kind of known kind of universally creates this artwork that is kind of you can relate to, right? And I was wondering if you see your work as humbly as that, or as that could be, kind of as a continuation of this.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I don't want to overstep the mark and compare myself to Michelangelo too much. But I think that piece, I talked about that piece specifically because I had quite a personal relationship to it, in the I think I mentioned it in terms of, so I went in this Vipassana retreat, which is a very intensive meditation retreat, 10 days, like 10 or 11 hours of like sitting meditation per day.
Yeah.
It really, I think I really got to a point when I felt like I was entering into this archetypal world, because my kind of psyche was throwing these images at me it was kind of like dreaming whilst being awake. And I felt like I was accessing images that are kind of within kind of the universal human psyche, because I was seeing things that looked a lot like the Torment of Saint Anthony by Michelangelo, for example, and like certain things by like Bosch, and then like I guess a lot of like masked rituals that exist throughout a lot of indigenous societies and stuff. And it all seemed, I had this sense that it was all stemming from this one place, which a lot of people, you know, I think Jung and Joseph Campbell, quite a lot of people have talked about this kind of singularity in our psyches, and like these entities, symbols, characters that just appear. So I think that's why I was so interested in that specific work. And yeah, I do think that's one of the important functions of art in general, to tap into these things that are within us, but we can't access on a day-to-day basis. Like we couldn't just, you know, take a look into our own psyches and just see what we can find, because there's so much else going on. And I think like, yeah, I think the current exhibition as well, that I have at the moment, called the Infinity Card,
which is at the gallery until mid-April, right?
Yes.
Cardiff.
In Cardiff, yeah.
You should all go. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, you got to get the plug. So yeah, I think what I'm doing there is I'm imagining if these ideas were kind of more a society where these ideas were more at kind of the forefront of people's thinking, and like if they had systems around these ideas and these symbols and these kind of universal archetypes that they could access and like find ways around these things. Yeah, I think I do think it's an important part of my practice, for sure. It's something I'm aiming towards in some weird roundabout way, you know?
I mean, there are whole kind of swathes of like art epochs that are kind of based around similar ideas, you know, like surrealism, for example, you know, based on that idea, how we kind of maybe portray those dreams. But let's go back to your exhibition at the Chapter Gallery. Joseph Morgan Schofield, he writes about being lost in time, and I think again that kind of harks back to the idea of a dream, right? In so much that time, to a certain extent, kind of indeterminate. But he writes something about being lost in time and not really understanding what tense he should use in writing about your work, which is something that's kind of obvious to kind of understand, because your work is, for lack of a better word, kind of timeless. And I was wondering, when we are looking at your work, are we looking at the past? Are we looking at the present? Are we looking at the future? Is that stuff, is it important at all? Like, maybe it's not important.
I think it is important, but I also don't think we can pin it down to one or the other. I think it's like we're looking at the strands that hold all these different tenses together. So like, I don't know, I think a lot in the show itself, a lot of it is just like, I'm being deliberately unclear, and I don't even know like where we are a lot of the time, you know? But I think conceptually, like, there is this, and this is also in the text that Joseph wrote, there is this idea of like the break, which is like the society emerges after some kind of event. And in my work, it's not necessarily clear what that event is, but it does allude to kind of diasporic religions that exist in the Americas, and you know, in the Caribbean, South America mostly, but also parts of North America, and how like after being kind of stripped of their culture, these people were like, you know, they needed to use the tools that were around them to like find new stories, and these stories didn't necessarily fit with the prescribed stories that they were given, such as Christianity, for example. But they had to use some kind of framework. So there was this real like warping of time and space that had to happen with their stories to kind of create this new belief system. And I think this is one thing I was alluding to, because I think everyone needs to like find stories that fit with their experience, right? And there's like, I don't know, there's like the whole argument that like, oh, Jesus was black, or like Jesus was white, Jesus was like, but it's like Jesus is just whoever you are, that's what Jesus is, you know? And it's like, that's the kind of idea that I'm kind of thinking of. It's like, so if I'm creating new narratives as a person of mixed heritage in the UK in 2022, it's like, okay, so what are my stories and what is their time structure? Like, where do they fit into time? So that's why there's like, yeah, there's symbols from the whole scope of time and space fitting within the work. And it's not, you know, it's not all religious kind of mystical stuff. You know, there's like Pokemon cards in there. There's like all of it, because it all feeds into this global kind of mess of symbols that we live in.
I mean, going back to kind of you kind of talking about Jesus and him being, or the idea of being a symbol that's kind of maybe kind of separated or disconnected from what we know that he probably was as a real person, right? And kind of appropriating that him and using him as a symbol for doing X, Y, or Z. I think that is something that also kind of mirrors your work a little bit, because, for example, in your exhibition at the Chapter Gallery, you kind of create an atmosphere and supply artifacts, but you really rely on the viewer and the person that engages with your exhibition to create their own kind of ritual and to take that kind of responsibility upon themselves. And I think that is such an interesting thing, because then you are then having a conversation that lies at the crossroads of kind of just having to decipher symbols that you supply for yourself, and maybe trying to kind of be a bit more passive and try to understand what the symbol mean to you as someone that has a subconscious, right? Could you talk a little bit about this tension and why it's important and what it means to you?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think like the way, so I think maybe with a body of work like this, it's assumed that there's the artist who has the full picture and like knows exactly what's going on, and then there's the viewer who's only being given certain parts of that picture. Whereas I think what is perhaps more true is that the world evolves from the work rather than necessarily the work evolving from the world. Because when I was developing the body of work, I didn't have the full picture in my head. I wasn't this kind of like omnipotent creator who had this, you know, I was creating the works one by one until the threads started to appear between them, and I was like, okay, I'm very drawn to this, and this seems to be like an important thing for me, and the way that I can understand myself, or like the things that come up in my own meditations or whatever, you know. And then that kind of transfers from work to work, and then like the picture builds up for me as the work is created. But you know, I think as the body of work got more and more developed, it was more a case of like, oh, let's like join the dots and let's create an experience for the person who's viewing these. But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of both, you know.
Yeah. Could you elaborate more what you mean by the world evolving from the work? Is it a process you hope that your body of work has an effect on the world that is around you, or?
I mean more like the world that is implied, and the exhibition is kind of set up as it's it's almost like a museum presenting a society, and that society only exists for me as I'm creating these objects and images, and then the picture for me becomes clearer and clearer the more I make, right, rather than having the picture pre-existing and then I'm making from that, you know.
I see what you mean. Going back to kind of the idea of symbols, it's kind of interesting because symbology in kind of contemporary art is something that's kind of died. I think it kind of happened post-war, or well, it started with the Enlightenment and so on and so forth. Now we have very few symbols in kind of contemporary cultural production, except for maybe games and TV shows of the last kind of 15 years. You mentioned kind of Pokemon. You talk about why you think kind of reintroducing these symbols is an important thing to do.
Well, I think firstly, I think that regardless of what conscious efforts people like contemporary artists make to reintegrate these symbols, I mean, maybe this is optimistic, but I like to think that like, not necessarily just symbols, but like the need for understanding through symbology, maybe. I have a feeling that regardless of what efforts I might make or other artists or people who are very conscious of this idea, I think there's a human tendency towards this. But when society grows more secular, or people become more disillusioned with religion, or I don't know, that way of understanding is kind of downplayed in favor of like rationality, science, for example. I always think the symbols and the rituals and these kind of things that we need for understanding the self will kind of emerge in like more and more bizarre ways, you know. And maybe that's where these kind of fun merges between religion and symbology and contemporary pop culture come in, because people, even though people say they don't, you know, I don't need this anymore, I just need like consumerism, for example, is maybe one of the replacements of that structure, or pop culture itself, and like the worship of you know, idol worship within pop culture, these kinds of things. I forgot where I was going with that. Yeah, I think what I was saying is the human tendency towards these things. I believe that they would always emerge in different ways. I don't necessarily know if those ways are all as helpful as each other.
Yeah.
But I think they will always exist in some way. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. I mean, talking about the kind of helpful and unhelpful ways in which they exist is quite a good segue into my next question, which I think I'll preamble with. It was kind of like the mid-noughties. I just got my first mobile phone, and my English teacher, I think, went on this hour-long rant about people using things like emojis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, which kind of makes me think about the kind of idea of symbology and how we use symbols to communicate with each other.
Yeah.
Do you think that's something that's kind of innate in humanity? Because it kind of feels like emojis are a ancestor of hieroglyphics or something, you know?
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, I think it's a very cool, like, new development in language.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it should be looked upon as like something beneath language, you know, because it's all language, you know.
Yeah.
Language just evolves in new ways. Yeah, I support emojis.
One more question. Kind of minding the collective seems to be something in which you're kind of interested in, right? And one area which kind of comes to mind is the kind of automated minding of the collective in order to create visual images or writing. There's that whole thing with the chat GPT. Was that at the beginning of this year or like end of last year? And basically my question kind of surrounds
sorry?
The chat GPT.
Oh, that one.
Okay.
And I've not used it, but I think I've seen examples. Yeah.
There've been so many opinion pieces and op-eds in X, Y, or Z place about it. I think it's something that we should all take note of it, whether for good or bad, that's up to whoever it is. But I was wondering if, as AI kind of minds the collective in order to create these images, and they're kind of familiar yet quite alien, because I think because of its non-propriety, right? It's the average of a lot of images.
Yeah. There's no artist's hand or like authorship.
No.
It's the collective. Yeah.
I was wondering if you've ever thought of using that in your work, or whether that's something whether it's something you've thought about, essentially.
I'm still. I think most people are still trying to gather their, work out their opinions on the whole AI thing, and like work out how they feel about it. I've signed up for the DALL-E 2 image maker thing, and I used it for a while as a way to like bring my dreams into images. Because I had so many. I go through phases of kind of noting down my dreams, and I, getting quite fixated on the symbolism. And it was a good way of kind of bringing some of these images that existed in my head, sometimes for years and years, like some of the ones that have really stuck with me. And yeah, bringing them into like manifesting them in ways that I couldn't. And that was more of a personal use of it for me. There is definitely some potential there. I think I can't quite get my head around what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's necessarily potential for like the furthering of like art as a practice necessarily, but like I think maybe in some kind of like therapeutic practice, or like some, I don't know, some way of bringing things. It's like manifesting things from the inside to the outside. It's like giving, creating images that couldn't necessarily be created before. Still very early on in my exploration of AI, but
so what kind of things were you doing? Were you just like basically just kind of writing out the keywords of like the things you can read? Wow.
So it takes a bit of work to get it to do what you want it to do.
Yeah.
From what I remember, there's certain things where you have to be really specific, because it just doesn't. Certain things it seems quite stubborn. It does. It's interesting because you do start to think of it as like as a being. It's like it's stubborn. It's stubborn on certain things, and it's quite easy on other things. Some things it doesn't like doing. But yeah, I think just like trial and error, just trying to hone in on different things until it looks like the thing that's in my head.
That's work, right? Because I mean, if like I don't remember my dreams, so kind of going through a process of kind of writing it down and kind of tweaking and tweaking and tweaking, like I would just be so scared that I would just forget it in the interim. But it seems like it kind of worked for you. Yeah.
Well, the more you write down your dreams, the more you remember them. That's a tip.
Okay, thank you.
If you ever want to get into it. So like I have a bit of a backlog of like things written down that I can draw from,
Amazing. But
yeah, there's a whole dream world out there to be explored, and yeah, there's a lot of interesting things happening in there.
Yeah,
for sure.